They deserve a new government that gets the future.
Time has expired, and I call the Assistant Minister.
Ooh, Nelly. Deputy Speaker, that was one performance. But do you know, Deputy Speaker, I listened to the whole matter of public importance speech, the opening batting from the member from McMahon about what he thought the Australian way was for cutting Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And do you know what he didn't mention? In the entire 10 minutes, I accept that if it was a 90-second, he would have struggled, but in the entire 10 minutes, he didn't mention one thing. One critical thing that's been at the heart of the Labor Party's policy position all week, which apparently is now the cataclysmic difference between whether you take climate change seriously or not, as we do on this side of the chamber, and it was to legislate a target. He didn't mention it once in a 10-minute diatribe. So clearly Labor have already abandoned their push for a legislated target. Clearly they've got the research back, and it backs this side of the chamber and what Australians think about a legislated target, because they know exactly, as the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction said in question time only moments ago, that when you legislate a target, what you actually do is see the power drift out of the hands of the parliament and directly into the hands of the courts, as we've seen in Germany, as we've seen in France, as we've seen in the United Kingdom. And what happens when you undermine this parliament isn't just that the members here don't get a chance to stand up and express their voice on behalf of the Australian community and the communities they represent, but you disempower the very Australians that elect us and their capacity to be able to decide the future of this great nation. And Australians know at the heart of the Labor Party plan for climate change is they have no respect for democracy. They have no respect for the will of the people, because we saw that from the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard before the 2010 election. And yes, I know you shake your head, Member McMahon. I know it's something you want to forget, like so many of the other failures in your policy space when you were a minister too, including those people who drowned under your watch.
The Assistant Minister will direct his comments through the chair.
But the reality is, Deputy Speaker, as you know, and I know, before the 2010 federal election, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, said there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead. And then they went out. Oh, that's right, the Assistant Minister is right. Sorry, the Minister, my apologies. Congratulations on your elevation, mind you. But there was. The Minister's 100% right. What actually happened was, after they made a commitment to the Australian people, they got their vote, and then they turned around and they tore the agreement up. They turned around and they spent $55 million trying to sell their spin and try and cover over their deception to the Australian people, because they said one thing before the election and something different thereafter. And we all know that this is the history and the track record of the Labor Party, and now they're seeking to repeat it. You compare that to this side of the chamber. We went to an election with a target. We went to an election making it crystal clear what our policy throughout this term of government would be. And, of course, we take the Australian people with us in prosecuting that critical argument, and they endorsed it every step of the way. And one of the best things about what this government has been achieving in the climate change policy space isn't just that we set out a 26 to 28% target by 2030, though we did. We got it endorsed by the Australian people, and we did. We then went on not just to meet, not just to beat, but to smash our targets. We're already 21% down on 2005 levels of emissions. And here's a reality. It's a very difficult one for the opposition and others critics outside of this chamber to accept. The OECD average of emissions reduction is but 7% off 2005 levels. And we are hitting 20.8%, 21%. 3 times the OECD average as the Prime Minister gets on a plane and goes off to Glasgow. And not only is he going to be able to report back that we're going to meet, beat and smash our targets in 2030, but he's going to be proudly able to put in a commitment from Australia, a statement very clearly from Australia that was outlined in our substantial plan this week to cut greenhouse gas emissions, of an upwards revision of our projection, where we will hit up to 35% emissions reduction by 2030. That's the fundamental difference between this side of the chamber and the Labor Party, and frankly, increasingly, the independents who are working with them. Oh, no, I'm definitely going to give the members. I haven't even got to them yet. Don't worry, member for McMahon. Where they are working directly with the Labor Party to subvert this our democracy. And you saw this in the bill from the member for Warringah in the earlier last year. We saw it exactly where it was. The member for Warringah introduced a bill that would have included the power for commissioners that the crossbench appointed, that these commissioners would be able to recommend to not allow the recommendation of the change of any emissions targets. What they wanted to do was empower commissioners to veto this parliament. And if there was any doubt about the intent or the objective of the member for Warringah, you just need to go and look at her speech only yesterday, Deputy Speaker, when she moved a motion to have a discussion about her failed bill, thrice rejected, where she spoke openly about the fact that Australian climate policy needs to be taken out of the hands of democratically elected representatives. Now, when you think about that, that is nothing short of disgraceful. For you to come into this parliament and then appoint commissioners who can veto the rights of the Australian people to be able to decide their own destiny. And now Labor are trying to support it every step of the way. Because despite the fact that the member for McMahon already, only 3 days after they started their narrative around legislating a target, despite the fact that he now seems to have abandoned it and walked away from a policy position so quickly, he says it's necessary to take the issue seriously. Well, I can tell you that must be a wake-up call to the state governments of Queensland and Western Australia that have Labor governments but no legislated target. It must be a spectacular wake-up call to the 185-odd countries in the world that have a target but it is not legislated. Because those countries, and frankly even state Labor governments, understand the consequences of Labor's policy. They know and they understand that when you follow the Labor approach, you're empowering bureaucrats and not citizens and communities. And I can tell you that is not what we on this side of the chamber see. I know that's not just what we see in this chamber. It's what we see in communities as well. I see it every election when I go to the polling booth. Every election. There's this bloke, I won't mention his name, let's just call him David R. And he stands there with his green hat of vote cards and he tells people to vote Green and for all of their policy ambition. And then as soon as the election is over, he comes storming into my office and demands that the Liberal Party adopt the positions that have just been defeated at the election. He does it every time, Minister, every time. But don't worry, Minister, he's independent now. He's not a Green, he's an independent now. And his track record, see, they're all tricky. They say one thing and do the other. The good thing is, in the community, everybody knows who these people are, Member McMahon. Everybody knows that these puppet masters who want to make puppets of the independence of members of parliament, and we're not going to let them, because I can tell you, the member for McMahon, we know exactly who you are. We know exactly that you have no respect for democracy, and we know that the member for Warringah has tried to appoint bureaucrats to have veto rights over the Australian Parliament, and now the Labor Party wants to do the same with the courts. So make no mistake, we see the tricky agenda. They may not up here in Canberra, but the people in our community know exactly the tricky behaviour you've got up to. And you compare that to this side of the chamber. Straightforward. Take an election policy, deliver it after winning an election, then go on and develop a substantial plan. First, comprehensive economy-wide plan to cut greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. 130 pages going through the different role of technology and the contribution that they can make. And not just one that focuses on what we as a government can do, but one that focuses on what communities can do, different levels of government, and empowers industry to be part of the solution. Because the only approach the Labor Party has is a tax. They won't reveal it yet, The member for Warringah won't reveal her plan for one yet either, but what they're secretly hoping is to get into minority government on the back of the Greens and Independents so they can pull the strings of a failed Labor government.
Member's time has